The Harborview didn't hire people who needed the job. That was the unspoken rule, the thing nobody said out loud during orientation, but that everyone understood within the first shift. The restaurant hired people who looked like they'd never needed anything in their lives. Pressed white shirts, quiet confidence, the particular kind of ease that comes from never having counted coins at a grocery checkout. Bridget Callahan had learned to fake it. She'd been faking it for 14 months. The posture she'd borrowed from her time in pre-med lecture halls, the calm she'd constructed from sheer necessity, the smile that said, of course, right away when what she meant was, "Please, I need this shift, I need this tip. My brother has a cardiology appointment on Thursday, and the parking alone costs $40. The Harborview sat on the waterfront in Halifax, Nova Scotia, occupying the upper 2 floors of a converted heritage building that had once been a shipping warehouse. In another life, the life Bridget had planned at 18, at 20, even at 22, she would have been a guest here, perhaps, celebrating a residency match or a conference paper. Instead, she carried plates of seared halibut at $160 per portion and smiled at people who looked through her like she was glass. She didn't mind. That was the honest truth, and she knew it surprised people when she said it out loud. She didn't mind because the Harborview paid better than any other front-of-house position in the city, because the head chef, a taciturn Acadian man named G. Isles, treated staff with a rough and genuine respect, and because the work itself had a rhythm she'd come to rely on. When her mind was tracking 4 tables, 2 courses, 1 allergy flag, and a birthday cake that needed to arrive at exactly the right moment, it couldn't also be sitting in the waiting room at the IWK Health Center, listening to a cardiologist explain, again, the particular mechanics of her younger brother, Noah's heart defect. Noah was 23. He'd been born with a bicuspid aortic valve, which had been manageable, then concerning, and was now edging toward critical. The surgery he needed cost nothing. This was Canada. Bridget reminded herself whenever the panic got too loud. This is Canada. The surgery is covered, but the months of preparation, the specialist visits, the medications, the time off work she'd need to take, the modifications to their shared apartment so he could recover properly. Those things added up in ways that kept her awake past midnight, doing calculations on her phone. She'd left Dalhousie's medical school after her first year. Not because she'd failed. She'd ranked 4th in her cohort, but because their father had died suddenly in the spring, leaving behind a mortgage, a mountain of debt nobody had known about, and a 22-year-old brother who needed someone to stay. Bridget stayed. She told herself it was temporary. That was 3 years ago. The reservation for Table 9 came in on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before the February long weekend. The Harborview's reservations manager, a meticulous woman named Paola, flagged it during the pre-service meeting with the particular tone she used for guests who required attention. "Rutherford party," Paola said, glancing at her tablet. 4 confirmed. The booking was made by a personal assistant under the name Rutherford, as in Rutherford. Someone at the back of the room let out a low breath. Donahue Rutherford was not a name that required explanation in Nova Scotia, or really anywhere east of Quebec. He'd built Rutherford Atlantica from a regional shipping company into one of the largest privately held infrastructure conglomerates in the country. Ports, rail logistics, cold storage facilities, a significant stake in 2 Atlantic universities. The kind of man whose name appeared on buildings and endowment funds, and occasionally on the front page of the Globe and Mail when he made a decision that rearranged the economic landscape of an entire province. He was also, Paola noted, bringing his mother. The elder Mrs. Rutherford is listed as hearing impaired, Paola continued. The note says she has significant hearing loss, progressive over the past 4 years. The assistant requested seating away from the live music section and asked that staff be aware she may not respond to verbal address. Bridget, standing near the server station at the back, made a note. Not on her pad, in her mind, where she kept the things that actually mattered. She'd learned ASL from a YouTube channel 3 years ago. Starting the same week, Noah had been diagnosed with the ventricular complications that had made ordinary conversation increasingly difficult for him on bad days. He didn't have hearing loss, but the fatigue that followed his episode left him foggy, slow to visual communication. So Bridget had learned. She'd gotten good. Not certified, not formally trained, but genuinely fluent in the way people become fluent in things they practice every single day because someone they love needs them to. She had never once mentioned it on her resume or during her shifts at the Harborview. It felt private. It felt like Noah's. Table 9 was positioned near the south window, which looked out over the harbor. The ice had come in early that year, and the view was extraordinary. Grey water, white flows, the distant silhouette of Dartmouth across the strait. Bridget had been assigned the section, which included tables 7 through 11, and she'd done her setup with the extra care she always brought to high-profile reservations without ever making a performance of it. They arrived at 7:15. Donahue Rutherford was younger-looking than his photographs suggested, mid-40s, with the kind of contained energy that made him seem like he was always about to stand up from whatever chair he was sitting in. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie. He shook hands with the maitre d', Etienne, with the practiced efficiency of a man who shook hands constantly, and had long since stopped thinking about it. Beside him was a woman Bridget assumed was his fiancée. She'd seen the engagement announcement in the Chronicle Herald, though she couldn't have said why she'd read it. Nadine Biozalail, tall, pale, with very straight, dark hair and an assessing quality to her gaze that she seemed to turn on the room the moment she walked in, cataloguing, calculating. She wore a dress that cost more than Bridget's monthly rent, and carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who knew exactly how much she was worth, and had arranged her life accordingly. Then there was the woman who came in last, a half-step behind, guided by Donahue's hand at her elbow, his mother, Evelyn Rutherford. She was perhaps 70, or a young-seeming 75. Silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, a dove-grey cardigan over a silk blouse, pearl earrings, small and unpretentious. She moved carefully, not because she was frail, but because the world, Bridget understood immediately, didn't always give her the information she needed to move through it confidently. Her eyes were sharp, alert, scanning, reading the room the way people with hearing loss learn to read rooms, gathering data from everything that couldn't be heard. The fourth member of the party was a man introduced as Donahue's associate, a younger man in his 30s named Crawford, who had the slightly unfocused look of someone who'd already had 2 drinks at the bar across the street. Bridget approached. She introduced herself to the table, made eye contact with each guest in turn, and caught the moment when Evelyn Rutherford looked at her mouth with that particular attention, tracking the words she couldn't hear, filling in the gaps from context and visual cues. It was so familiar it made Bridget's chest ache. She turned slightly toward Evelyn when she spoke, not pointedly, not in a way that would embarrass her, just enough. She'd learned that from Noah, too. Don't make it a production. Just make it easier. Nadine noticed. Of course she noticed. Bridget had the sense that Nadine noticed everything, but the look on her face wasn't warm. It was the look of someone cataloguing a variable they hadn't accounted for. The first hour was uneventful. Bridget took the orders, Donahue and Crawford the halibut, Nadine a beet and burrata salad followed by the duck confit, Evelyn, the potato leek soups and the Atlantic salmon. When she reached Evelyn, she angled her body and pitched her voice the way she always did, and Evelyn gave her a small, courteous nod that said, "I caught mostful, exactly. Not more like relieved. The quiet relief of someone who was used to being talked around rather than to. She brought the first courses. She checked on the table twice, precisely enough, not hovering. She monitored from a distance the way she'd been trained to, reading body language the way the Harbour View's floor manager expected, anticipating needs before they were voiced. What she was reading, as the first courses gave way to the main, was a conversation between Donahue and Nadine that had the surface texture of pleasant dinner talk and the subterranean current of something else entirely. Donahue was, she could see, talking about his mother. She caught phrases in passing. The house on Purcell's Cove, the care arrangement, the specialist in Montreal. He was leaning slightly toward Nadine, with the body language of someone seeking agreement he hadn't quite received yet. Nadine was nodding, but the nods were the controlled kind, the kind that meant yes, I'm listening, not yes, I agree. Evelyn was eating her salmon with the composed attention of someone who understood she was being discussed and had made peace, or something like peace, with not being part of the conversation. Bridget refilled the water glasses. She came to Evelyn's side last. She didn't plan what happened next. She genuinely didn't. It came out of the same instinct that made her check whether Noah had taken his afternoon medication before she left for a shift, the same instinct that made her reroute her walk home to pass the pharmacy when she knew his prescription was running low. The instinct of someone who had spent 3 years paying close attention to overlook. Is the salmon all right? She signed, her hands low and unobtrusive beside the table, the question small and casual. The way you'd ask it of anyone. Evelyn went very still. Then she looked up from her plate, and the expression on her face was not what Bridget had expected. It wasn't surprise, exactly. It was something older and more complicated, the expression of a person who has been handed, without warning, something they had stopped believing was going to come. Perfect, she signed back, her hands moving with the fluency of someone who had been signing for decades. Thank you. And then, with a flicker of something that might have been wry humor, it's the first time I've been asked. Bridget managed the smile she gave at tables, professional, warm, the one that gave nothing away, and moved back to the server station. She became aware, a moment later, that Nadine was watching her. Not the polite observation of a guest tracking good service, something more intent. Bridget kept her expression neutral, refilled a glass at table 10, returned to the station to check her timing. When she glanced back, Nadine had turned to Donahue and said something close to his ear. The thing about serving, the thing Bridget had discovered in 14 months and suspected career servers knew before their first week was out, was that you became invisible in a very specific way. Guests forgot you were there, which meant they forgot to modulate what they showed you. She'd witnessed marriage proposals going wrong, business deals being walked back, children being cruel to parents in public, in ways they'd never have managed if they'd remembered the person refilling their water glass was a real human being with functioning ears and a working memory. What she saw, in the 90 seconds before Etienne caught her eye from across the room and beckoned, was Nadine's hand closing briefly over Donahue's on the tablecloth. Not affection. Something that looked, from the far side of a decade of paying close attention to people, more like instruction. Etienne met her at the edge of the service corridor. Mrs. Biozolale asked to speak with the floor manager, he said quietly. I've spoken with her. She has asked that you be reassigned from table 9. Bridget looked at him. The reason given, Etienne continued, with the careful neutrality of a man who had been in hospitality for 25 years and had learned to deliver unpleasant things without coloring them, was that you were making the elder Mrs. Rutherford uncomfortable with unsolicited gestures. Unsolicited gestures. The phrase had a very precise quality to it, like it had been chosen in advance. I used sign language, Bridget said, keeping her voice the same temperature as the room. Mrs. Rutherford is hearing impaired. I asked if her salmon was satisfactory. Etienne nodded once, which meant I know, and also it doesn't matter, and also I'm sorry. Serge will take table 9, he said. You're on 11-12, and the bar overflow tonight. She nodded. She went back to work. What she did not do was look at table 9 again for the next 40 minutes. What she did, instead, was what she always did when something threatened to crack the composure she'd built so carefully over the past 3 years. She focused on the tasks immediately in front of her, and she let the anger move through her like weather, violent and temporary, and ultimately not in charge. She thought about Noah. Assant. She thought about the surgery consult in March. She thought about the fact that she needed this job. She thought about Evelyn Rutherford's face when she'd been asked, in the language she actually spoke, if her meal was all right. It was 47 minutes later, by Bridget's count, when Evelyn Rutherford stood up from table 9. Bridget noticed, because she noticed everything in her section and the adjacent sections. It was the reflex of a good server, and also, she suspected, the reflex of someone who had spent too long being responsible for another person's well-being to ever fully switch it off. She was at table 12 when she saw Evelyn rise, touch her napkin to the table with the precise courtesy of someone who had been raised to leave things tidy, and move toward the corridor that led to the washrooms. She was moving slowly. Not frail, Bridget held to that assessment, but uncertain, which was different. The hallway to the washrooms was narrow and L-shaped, and the ambient noise in the Harborview's dining room, even moderated, bounced differently in enclosed spaces. For someone navigating without the auditory information most people relied on, it was genuinely disorienting. Nadine did not look up from her conversation with Crawford. Donoghue was facing the window, speaking into his phone. Bridget excused herself from table 12. She followed the hallway. She found Evelyn standing at the junction of the L, one hand on the wall, her face turned in the wrong direction. She'd taken the branch that led to the private dining room rather than the washrooms, and the light was dimmer there, and she had stopped. She didn't look panicked. She looked tired in the particular way people get tired when they've been navigating a world not designed for them for so long that the exhaustion has become a kind of posture. Bridget stepped into her sightline. She moved slowly, no sudden approach, the way she'd learned to approach Noah on a bad day. This way, she signed, gesturing toward the correct corridor. Washrooms are around the corner. I'll walk with you. Evelyn looked at her hands. Then she looked at her face. They told you not to do that, she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who'd lost the ability to monitor their own volume. It was clear, carefully enunciated, slightly louder than the space required. The woman with Donoghue. She spoke to someone. It wasn't a question. Bridget didn't answer immediately. She thought about Etienne. She thought about her section, currently unattended. She thought about the mortgage equivalent of tips she was counting on to cover Noah's medication top-up this month. She did. She signed. And then, because she'd never in her life been good at strategic dishonesty, I'm here anyway. Something in Evelyn Rutherford's face shifted. Not dramatically. It was the smallest possible adjustment, the recalibration of someone who had stopped expecting anything and had just received something. She allowed Bridget to walk her to the washroom. At the door, she paused. Will you wait, she signed. her hand slower than Bridget's but precise. The hands of someone who had been signing for 40 years. "I won't be long. I'd like to talk." They stood in the short corridor outside the washroom, and Evelyn Rutherford talked. Or rather, she signed, and occasionally spoke simultaneously in the way bilingual signers sometimes do when they're thinking in both languages at once. And Bridget listened with her eyes and her attention, and the part of her that had learned over 3 years that listening to someone's silence was often more important than listening to their words. Evelyn had been losing her hearing since '68, progressively, a sensory neural loss the audiologists had explained carefully, and then, essentially, left her to manage. She had learned ASL in her 70s, late and effortful in the way second languages are after a certain age. But she'd committed to it because the alternative, the nodding, the pretending, the being talked around, had been quietly destroying something in her. She had been widowed for 6 years. She and Donahue had always been close. He was a good son, she said it plainly, without the particular inflation mothers sometimes use for grown children who are, in fact, complicated. But his life had accelerated in ways that left little room. The company. The travel. Nadine. She said Nadine's name the way you say a word you've been practicing, carefully, without affect. "She's been very helpful," Evelyn signed, and the flatness of the phrase said everything the words didn't. "How long have they been engaged?" 14 months. A pause. "She moved into the house on Purcell's Cove 8 months ago. My house," she added, and there was something in the way she shaped the words, "my house," a particular quality compressed, like a door being held almost shut. "Donahue thought it would be good for me to have company, to have help." Her hands slowed. "I had a fall in October. It wasn't serious, but there were phone calls afterward, appointments I wasn't told about in advance. A doctor I'd never met who asked me questions about my memory." Bridget's chest went very still. What kind of questions? Whether I forgot things, whether I became confused, whether I had moments of... Evelyn paused, searching for the sign, then chose the spoken word instead. Disorientation. Her hands moved again. "I told him I was hearing impaired. I told him that missing half of a conversation is not the same as forgetting. He wrote things on his paper and didn't show me." "Do you know who arranged that appointment?" Evelyn's eyes met hers directly. In the dim corridor light, they were very steady. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Bridget walked back to the dining room with the careful composure of someone holding a full glass in turbulent weather. She knew what she'd heard. She also knew what it could be. A misunderstanding, a well-intentioned if clumsy intervention, a protective instinct that had overstepped. She'd been in medicine long enough, or close enough to it, to know that families sometimes arranged assessments for elderly relatives out of genuine concern, and that elderly relatives sometimes resisted them out of pride, and that the truth was usually more complicated than either party's account. But she'd also been paying attention to people for long enough to know the difference between a woman resisting help and a woman describing a situation she was frightened of and had no language to name. She went back to her sections. She served. She smiled. She brought dessert to table 12 without anyone having to ask, because she'd been counting their time. At table 9, she did not look at Nadine Beausoleil, because it was 20 minutes before the end of the dinner service when Donahue Rutherford flagged her down. She hadn't gone near table 9 since the reassignment, but he stood up from his chair and stepped into the path between her section and his with the kind of quiet authority that didn't require volume. "Excuse me," he said. "You're the server who was reassigned from our table." "Yes," Bridget said. "Even. Careful." He studied her for a moment. He had, up close, a more careful quality than she'd expected from his reputation. the particular attention of someone who'd learned, probably through expensive mistakes, to look at things more than once before forming conclusions. "My mother asked me to find you," he said. What happened in the next 11 minutes happened in the particular suspended way of things that rearrange the order of other things. Donahue Rutherford did not make scenes. This was clear within 30 seconds. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, didn't perform any of the high-drama confrontations Bridget had witnessed in her 14 months at the Harborview. He simply asked his mother, directly, in the clear, careful way of someone who understood that looking at her face mattered, what she had told the server in the corridor. Evelyn had not expected to be asked. That was clear too. The small flinch of surprise, quickly composed. She'd lived for 8 months in a version of Donahue where he was present but filtered, present but partial, present but somehow receiving her through Nadine as an intermediary. She signed. She spoke. She told him about October, about the doctor, about the questions. Bridget stood to the side, not interpreting. She hadn't been asked to. But she watched Donahue's face as the information arrived, piece by piece, and she watched the moment when the careful, composed expression of a man managing his evening shifted into something older and plainer. Nadine said from across the table, "Evelyn, I arranged that appointment because I was worried about you. Donahue was traveling, and you'd fallen." Donahue held up one hand, not angry. Something quieter than angry, more deliberate. "Who was the doctor?" he said. A pause. "A specialist," Nadine said. "A geriatric. I want the name. I want to see the notes from that appointment." His voice was still level, still the voice of a man who ran board meetings and navigated regulatory bodies. But there was something beneath it now. "I want to understand what was discussed, and I want to understand why I wasn't told." Crawford had gone very still, with the look of someone calculating the cost of being present for what was about to happen. Nadine looked at Bridget. It was a specific look, the kind that says you don't belong here, this is not your world, you have misunderstood your place in this room. Bridget had received that look before, in various forms, from various people over the course of her life, and she had developed a particular relationship with it, neither wounded nor indifferent but clear-eyed. She knew what the look meant. She also knew that the meaning didn't make it true. She met Nadine's eyes. She didn't look away. The Harborview's dining room emptied the way it always did on weeknights. Gradually, with the particular quiet of a space returning to itself after hours of performance. Gilles came out from the kitchen at 9:45 to check the close, as he always did. He found Bridget at the service station doing her end-of-shift inventory with the focused efficiency he'd come to rely on, and he asked, in the oblique way he asked things, how the evening had gone. "Fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who'd been watching people for a long time and knew the difference between fine and fine. He didn't push. That was one of the things she appreciated about Gilles. She found out 3 days later, through the particular grapevine that ran through every restaurant service ecosystem in every city in the world, that Donahue Rutherford had cancelled the appointment that had been scheduled for the following month. A second consultation with the geriatric specialist Nadine had found, and had instead arranged for his mother to meet with her own physician of 30 years, accompanied by a certified ASL interpreter. She found out, a week after that, through Paula, who had received a call from Donahue's personal assistant, that Table 9 had made a reservation for the following Saturday, just Donahue and his mother, no additional guests. And she found out, when she arrived for her Saturday evening shift, that Etienne had reassigned her sections to put her back on Table 9. She didn't know what she expected. She brought water, as she always did. She handed menus that neither of them needed, Because she'd already described the evening specials twice, she was precise, and she was warm, and she kept her hands low and ready. When she came for the order, Evelyn looked at her across the table with those sharp, settled eyes and signed, "Same salmon." And thank you, not for the salmon. Bridget signed back, "How is Purcell's Cove?" Something like amusement crossed Evelyn's face. "Better," she signed, "quieter." And then, "He's learning." Slowly, he practices in the car on the way over and pretends he hasn't. She glanced at Donoghue, who was looking out at the harbour with the expression of someone pretending not to be aware he was being discussed. "He's been practicing," Evelyn signed again, and this time there was something in her face that was simply love. The plain, unglamorous kind, the kind that coexists with frustration and history and years of accumulated complication, and persists anyway. Bridget went back to the service station. She put the order through. She stood for a moment at the south window, where, past the harbour lights and the February ice floes, the lights of Dartmouth glittered against the dark. She thought of Noah. She thought of Thursday's appointment. She thought of the particular quality of being seen, really seen, by someone who had stopped expecting it, the way Evelyn's hands had moved in that dim corridor, careful and precise and full of things that had needed somewhere to go. She thought about the letter she'd received that morning, the one from Dalhousie she hadn't opened yet, sitting on her kitchen counter next to Noah's pill organizer, the one with the return address that meant either a form letter or something else, the one she'd been afraid to open, because she'd been afraid of both outcomes, the nothing it might contain, and the something. She would open it tonight. That was what she decided, standing at the south window of the harbour view while the dinner service hummed and the ice sat still on the dark water outside. She would open it tonight, and whatever it said, she would figure out what came next. She'd been doing that for 3 years. She was getting quite good at it.